Hi, everybody. Thank you again for tuning in. Thank you for being patient. I really do love class discussion and I never want to cut it off. So I apologize that sometimes I get behind, but I appreciate you all bearing with me. So this lecture will be on chapter 10, which is global inequality. Again, my specialty is more so in the US, but I do find it incredibly interesting to compare the US to other countries, see where we're at. Um, I do want to, disclaimer, I'm not in any way trying to bash our country, but I do care about our country. This is my country. I care about improving, you know, myself, my community, and my country in general. And that does include being critical. That includes being critical of where we're at, being aware of where we're at, and then using that information to determine how we can be better. If we care about our country, then we'll want to improve it, and that does include being critical. So with that said, global inequality refers to typically the concentration of resources in certain areas or in certain nations. It is interesting as a sociologist to think about nation states as social constructs because, of course, the lines and the borders don't exist naturally other than that we have decided that they're there. But of course, as we talked about social stratification in the last chapter, being, stratification within a society, global stratification refers to unequal distribution of resources within countries or between countries, I mean. So I'm not going to get too much into this stuff. I do suggest that you review it. Um, but I have some charts that I'd rather kind of focus on. This stuff, honestly, I don't know how I feel about this stuff. I don't even feel like teaching that stuff because I feel like this terminology is something that needs to be improved. But if anyone has any opinions on that, let me know. Um, this also seems kind of ethnocentric, but it's okay, I guess. But this is a chart that shows us the world by income as of 2018. So we can see here that the US is a very high income nation. Looks like most of the North America in general. Well, wait, no, this is why I can't teach global inequality. I'm like, is that Greenland, Iceland, Greenland? I don't know. I digress. I'm like, looking at maps is embarrassing for me. But okay, so obviously the US is a high income nation, and that's great and all, whatever. We'll have an economics chapter, but it is interesting because we do still have so much inequality within our country, even though we are such a high income nation, we still have so many people who are so low income. Um, so going into whatever, you can read all this stuff if you want. It's kind of just semantics. We talked about mobility. I just wanted to kind of go through some charts that I quite literally just my dog was barking. I didn't know he was like locked in the bedroom. He's just being weird out. But so I wanted to bring up some charts, and it's just some charts that like I think are interesting that I just pulled off Google earlier today. But I encourage you to do the same thing with things that you're interested in. So for example, I started with just kind of firearms, right? So I was like, all right, firearms by country. And of course, we have the United States all the way at the top. So that if we were to look up, rates of firearm homicides by country, of course, again, we have the United States at the top. School shootings. I just picked this topic because we're all very familiar with it. I'm sure none of this will be a surprise to you, so it makes sense. Um, Definitely curious about your opinion on all of this for sure. But so then looking at kind of like wealth inequality by country, we do see that the US is, darker red here. So we do, even though we have very high um, wealth, we have very high wealth inequality as well, as compared to other countries as well. And then another thing, as I mentioned in the last chapter, one of the things that I like to focus on when I do talk about poverty in class and in general is child poverty. Because especially in the US, most of the people in poverty are under the age of 18. So looking at the child poverty rate is interesting and, can't get into it in this lecture, but we even have a deep poverty rate that we consider as sociologists. And I think that, and I've read this book, I have it, it's called Poverty and Power, but it was written by John Fagan, but it was probably published in like 2013. So the stat probably isn't updated, but I would be curious if anyone could find something updated. But the last time when I read that book, it said that the US was in the top three of like the highest deep poverty rate for children. So there's poverty rate, like how many children are in poverty, but then how many children are in deep poverty? And the US tops that as well, which is interesting. Not tops it, but is probably still in the top five. So then looking at healthcare comparisons, which is also interesting. There's all sorts of different healthcare whatever situations that are going on in different countries. But this is just a cute one I found comparing the US and Denmark, where, in the US, we have paid healthcare, higher medical wages, we're statistically less healthy, lower tax rates, but we spend a lot more on healthcare as a country. That was also another interesting graph that I had seen on Google looking at what country spends the most on healthcare. And we're towards the top there, like we spend a lot on healthcare, which is interesting because we have so many people without it. But so as compare US to Denmark, they have free healthcare, lower medical wages, people are more healthy statistically, there are higher tax rates, and that's where people kind of get a little freaked out. But the country as a whole spends less on healthcare. But that is kind of the big thing in the US. We want to, I guess, keep our tax rates low, but it does come at a cost to our community. Going off of kind of like healthcare, it's interesting to look at, okay, so, is there paid sick leave? And how does that look by country? And of course, in the US, we don't have paid sick leave. It's very rare that people have paid sick leave. And if they do, it's maybe just a few days or maybe 5 days out of the year. It's not often. And because of that, this graph kind of asks, does paid sick leave support reducing infectious disease spread? And I don't know the answer. But it is interesting just to see that we don't have any paid sick leave as compared to other countries most do. Even when it comes to something less important than sick leave, but vacation, in the US as well, we have no days of annual leave and we have 10 days of public holiday, whereas maybe it's just interesting to look at this. I guess when I look at this, I think about like days of annual leave where, for example, let's say it's Christmas in the United States, there's still people who need to work on Christmas and they're offered typically more money to work on Christmas, but it's, it creates an inequality because there's certain people who will be able to work on holidays and certain people who don't, and those who are able to give up those whatever, it creates a mess. I'm sure you can kind of imagine, but this is interesting. There's also, so then looking at kind of, I wanted to get into kind of like maternal and infant mortality and morbidity, but I'm going to let y'all do that. But it would be interesting. There's so many different aspects when it comes to postpartum care in the US for mothers specifically, but also paternal leave. So for example, my stats teacher said, why are women paid less? And, he made some guesses and he was like, because they can get pregnant. If a woman can get pregnant, that means that they're going to need some time off, whereas a man won't need time off. She'll need, maybe some extra care, it's just more expensive. And she might have multiple children, which means multiple periods of time off over the next, decade while she establishes her family. And something that would combat that is, for example, if let's say maternal leave is required 6 months, if paternal care, if the fathers, if the men were also required to take that 6 months and not offered to take that 6 months. Because if they're offered, they can still say no and work and still be seen as this more valuable asset, right? But if fathers were required to take paternal leave at the same amount of time as the mother did, then that might kind of ward off some of the stigma, right? So not just offering paternal care to men, but almost requiring them to do it so that there's less of a gender difference. Just that's a personal idea. That's just me going off. But you can also see that, once people do have, well, so it's interesting, right? Access to abortion. This one should have been up here maybe, but you can see that, well, I mean, y'all know, y'all have been living through it, but in the US, it's very, it's sus. It's very limited, our access to abortion here, right? Um, but it's interesting because you can't, we have limited access to abortion, but then when it comes to actually having that baby, there's a lot of things that governments do and countries do to support mothers. This is from, maternal leave, having time off. Some countries send like nurses to come help the mother for the first couple of weeks. Some countries send like psychiatrists and mental health care, psychologists to talk to the mom, make sure she's, not going through any sort of postpartum depression. And if she is, offering her that support. There's all sorts of things, as well as, free childcare if needed. There's all sorts of things that governments and countries do to support mothers after giving birth that we don't really do in the US. And this is just one example in terms of just like postpartum home visits. In some countries, this is just a required automatic service that's offered. Whereas in the US, you can see this is just covered by some healthcare systems, and it's definitely not a guaranteed thing. Another aspect you can look at is incarceration, right? We know our incarceration rates are off the chain. And then also, our incarceration rates are long. I was trying to find a chart that compared recidivism by country, but I couldn't find one. If anyone does, extra credit points, send it to me. But I'm just trying to give you some ideas as to what you can do to kind of compare stats by country and just look at where we are. And it's okay to be critical and be like, "Ooh, we're behind here. So maybe this is something I can do, or, inspire people to work towards to improve our country, so that we can be comparable." Um, so then really not much left. It was just funny because I talked about relative and absolute poverty in the last chapter, but it's interesting because here it says that now we call absolute poverty extreme poverty. It's a newer term. So again, being unable to afford the basic necessities such as like clothing, food, shelter, water. Whereas relative poverty has more to do with like the subjectivity and the needs of the actual society. Yeah, more subjective, right? Definitely, this is kind of redundant. So, and I actually talked about poverty line in the last chapter, so I won't go through that. I had these same slides. But this is where you get a little reward if you did watch these lectures. I'm going to offer you an extra journal prompt for extra credit if you want it. Not required, but if you want it. It's based off a class activity that I did do in class, but I'm going to just turn it into a extra credit journal prompt. So I do want to say that this is an additional journal prompt. I think I wrote this weird. I meant to say that this is an additional journal prompt on top of the ones that are already required. So this won't count as a reflection. This won't count as a whatever. This is going to be on top. This is going to be an extra journal entry. But I'm just looking for 3 to 5 sentences, again, a short paragraph. And I would love to see what you come up with in terms of your own little research project on comparing the US with other countries. And these are just some ideas, wage gap, maternal and paternal after, like postpartum care, maternal and infant morbidity and mortality, incarceration rates, recidivism rates, child poverty, child deep poverty. You look at gun laws, restrictions, abortion laws and restrictions, education, etc. Just different rights. You can pick any subject that you want and just do a little write-up. Again, just 3 to 5 sentences and tell me about, what you learned, what you're comparing. Maybe give me like a statistic, right, with some numbers. So you can give me like, oh, well, in the US, we have this percent, and over here we have this percent. But just do a quick little write-up as a journal entry, and I will offer 10 extra credit points to your midterm if you complete this thoughtfully. So thank you again for, tuning in and taking the time to review these lectures, even though they weren't during class time and during personal time. And I hope that the extra credit opportunity can be helpful to some of you. And again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. I'm here to help, and I'm excited to see you all in class tomorrow. Bye.